In the year 1918, a team of construction workers laboring in the state of Kentucky uncovered a sealed metal container buried deep within the earth. Inside this box, they discovered a collection of 17 ledgers, each bound in leather. These books contained entry after entry, all written by hand with meticulous detail, recording the sale of 637 human bodies to medical institutions all across the United States. These transactions took place between the years 1784 and 1821. Every single entry in these ledgers ended with the same deeply unsettling phrase: "Coffin weighted appropriately," and then, "Family none the wiser." But the most horrifying details were the entries marked with small red crosses. These 418 symbols indicated the human beings who were still alive at the moment the Ashworth brothers chose them to become specimens for their highly profitable business. Before we go any deeper into the account of the Ashworth family and their sinister activities centered around Death Valley Cemetery, we'd like to extend an invitation for you to subscribe to our channel. We bring you more true stories of historical horror that are frequently passed over by mainstream historical accounts. Please click that subscribe button, and we'd love for you to comment down below, telling us which state you are listening from today. We have received messages from viewers in all 50 states who share our deep interest in uncovering the most hidden and dark secrets from America's past. Now, let's journey back in time to the wild, untamed forests of Kentucky in the late 1700s, where three brothers would take a tranquil burial ground and turn it into the heart of an operation that would end the lives of hundreds of people. Deep within the thick pine forests of eastern Kentucky, there is a small, open space known as Death Valley. Despite the cheerful appearance of wildflowers that bloom there every spring, the location was not given its name for any natural beauty. Sometime between 1784 and 1821, this remote piece of land became the focal point of what may be the most horrifying criminal operation in the early history of the United States, an enterprise that was responsible for the deaths of more than 600 people and involved a web of well-regarded professionals spread across 6 different states. The complete and terrible scope of these crimes stayed hidden for almost 100 years, until a completely accidental find in 1918 brought to light a set of ledgers that documented a systematic operation of murder, deception, and profiteering, all organized by 3 brothers: an undertaker named Ezekiel Ashworth, a gravedigger named Murray Ashworth, and the community's trusted religious leader, preacher Zachariah Ashworth. What makes this situation especially disturbing is not just the brothers' cold, methodical way of committing murder, but how they took advantage of the sacred trust given to them by a community in mourning. When families came to Death Valley Cemetery to lay their loved ones to their final rest, they had no idea that the caskets being lowered into the earth held nothing more than rocks and sand. The real bodies of their family members were being embalmed, crated, and sent off to medical schools located all along the eastern coast of the country. These were institutions that were desperate for human cadavers and were prepared to pay huge amounts of money while asking very few questions about where these bodies came from. This operation went on without any interference for decades, growing from simply robbing graves when the opportunity arose to planning and carrying out calculated murders. As the demand from medical colleges increased, the brothers created a system for picking the perfect victims, who were usually lone travelers passing through the remote eastern counties of Kentucky, people with no family ties, people who would not be missed by anyone. The final entries in the ledgers suggest the business had expanded to include dozens of accomplices, including medical doctors, university professors, and even government officials, all of whom made money from this gruesome trade. This dark period in American history was almost completely forgotten until a widow named Elizabeth Caldwell started asking questions about her husband's coffin, which had felt suspiciously light. In the fall of 1821, this began a series of events that would finally reveal the full and terrible horror of what had really been happening at Death Valley Cemetery. The community that would later be called Ashworth Creek started as just a small cluster of log cabins tucked into the dense woods of eastern Kentucky, roughly 50 miles from the border with Virginia. By 1784, it had expanded to include about 40 families, most of whom had moved from Virginia and North Carolina, looking for good farmland and new beginnings after the Revolutionary War. The people there were mostly Baptist, with a strong sense of self-reliance that was common in frontier settlements. The closest town of any significant size was almost 2 days away on horseback, which left Ashworth Creek very much cut off from the world, particularly during the winter months when the mountain paths became completely blocked by snow and ice. The Ashworth brothers came to the area in the spring of 1784, introducing themselves as capable and ambitious men, arriving at a time when the growing settlement was in great need of both. Ezekiel, the oldest at 32 years old, had previous experience as an undertaker from his time in Philadelphia. Morai, 2 years younger than Ezekiel, was a skilled carpenter who quickly became the settlement's go-to gravedigger and coffin maker. Zachariah, the youngest at 27, was perhaps the most immediately valuable to the community. He was a Baptist preacher with formal education from a seminary in Virginia, which was very unusual for such a remote area. Within just 6 months of their arrival, the brothers had established Death Valley Cemetery on a 5-acre piece of land they bought on the eastern edge of the settlement. Zachariah explained to the community that the name was a reference from the Bible, the Valley of the Shadow of Death, from the Book of Psalms, rather than a gloomy choice. The spot was perfect. It was on high enough ground to avoid flooding, yet the soil was soft enough for easy digging. More importantly, for the brothers' secret purposes, it was located near a little-used trade route that connected to bigger roads leading toward Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other points further east. The main building in the cemetery was a small white chapel where Zachariah held Sunday services and funeral ceremonies. Behind this chapel stood a long, low building that served as Ezekiel's undertaking business, where he prepared bodies for burial. Next to that was Morai's workshop, where he built caskets of different levels of quality to match what the families of the deceased could afford. The brothers all lived together in a 2-story house at the very edge of the property, separated from the cemetery by a group of pine trees. The community quickly grew to respect the Ashworth brothers. Ezekiel carried himself with a serious dignity that suited his profession. His careful attention to detail when preparing the dead for viewing gave comfort to grieving families. Morai was quieter, often seeming awkward in social situations, but his skill as a craftsman was undeniable. His caskets were known for their quality, with perfectly fitted joints and smooth finishes, even on the most basic models. But it was Zachariah who truly won the community's trust and admiration. Handsome and full of charisma, he delivered powerful sermons that deeply moved his frontier congregation. He had a special talent for comforting those in mourning, offering words that somehow made their loss easier to bear. His prayers spoken over new graves often brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic settlers. Children were especially drawn to him, following him around the settlement during his pastoral visits. The Reverend has God's own gift for easing suffering. A woman named Martha Tunney said after Zachariah led her husband's funeral in the winter of 1785, "I don't know how we'd manage death in this wilderness, without the Ashworths to guide us through it. What no one in Ashworth Creek realized was that the brothers had specifically chosen their community after doing careful research. They had spent almost a full year traveling through various frontier settlements before picking this particular one for its isolation, its growing number of people, and, most importantly, its location in relation to the expanding system of medical education in America's eastern cities. The late 18th century was the beginning of formal medical education in the United States. Medical schools were being set up in Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Boston, and they all faced the same critical shortage: human cadavers for anatomical study. The laws at the time heavily restricted access to bodies for dissection, usually allowing medical schools to only use the corpses of executed criminals. This supply was nowhere near enough to meet the demand, which created a black market where a fresh, well-preserved body could be sold for incredibly high prices. The Ashworths were in a unique position to take advantage of this demand. Ezekiel had previously worked as an assistant at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, where he had made contacts with doctors who were desperate for anatomical specimens. Morai had developed techniques for preserving bodies during his earlier job with a shipping company that transported goods through different climates, and Zachariah's credentials as a religious man provided the perfect cover for their operation, giving their handling of the dead an unquestionable air of legitimacy. "We provide a service to the living and the dead," Ezekiel wrote in the first entry of his ledger, dated June 17, 1784. The deceased serve the advancement of medical knowledge while their families receive the comfort of proper burial rites. That the families believe they are burying their loved ones is a mercy. They need never know the higher purpose their departed now serve. The brothers' operation started in a small way. When someone died in the community, the family would naturally call upon the Ashworths. Ezekiel would collect the body, promise to prepare it for a viewing, and bring it to his establishment. There, he would carefully examine the corpse, deciding if it was suitable for anatomical study. Bodies of people who had died from contagious diseases were usually considered unsuitable, as were those that had already begun to decompose significantly. For the bodies Ezekiel thought were valuable, the brothers would then carry out their deception. After the family had viewed their loved one, arranged peacefully in an open casket with the face visible, but the body covered with a burial cloth, Ezekiel would ask them to leave, explaining that he needed to do some final preparations before sealing the coffin. Once he was alone, he would move the body to a hidden cellar beneath the preparation room, which was accessed through a trap door concealed under a heavy work table. In the cellar, Ezekiel would begin the preservation process, usually injecting a solution of alcohol, salt, and various herbs into the main blood vessels. The body would then be packed in a mixture of salt and sawdust inside a specially made shipping container, narrow wooden crates that Morai built to look like ordinary tool chests. Meanwhile, Morai would fill the coffin with rocks, sand, and, in the winter, frozen dirt, carefully distributed to feel about the same weight as a human body. The coffin would then be sealed shut, ready for the funeral service. Zachariah would perform a moving ceremony, speaking beautifully about resurrection and eternal peace, while the family remained completely unaware that their loved one's body was not in the casket, but in the brothers' cellar, waiting to be transported. The early entries in the ledger show a very cautious approach. In their first year, the brothers shipped only 8 bodies to their contacts at medical schools in Philadelphia and New York. The payments were substantial, between $17 and $25 per body, at a time when a skilled worker might earn $1 for a day's work. The money was delivered through an arrangement with traveling merchants who acted as unknowing couriers, carrying sealed packets they believed contained business letters. Received payment for subject number 8 today. Ezekiel wrote in April 1785. $23. Our best price yet. Dr. H. at Pennsylvania Medical College specifically requested more specimens showing healed bone fractures. Must keep watch for appropriate subjects. By 1787, the operation had been so successful that the brothers expanded their cemetery, buying more land next to it and extending the road that connected to the main trade route. They also started offering their services over a wider area, collecting and preparing bodies from settlements up to 20 miles away. This expansion let them increase their shipments to 15 bodies that year. The isolation that made this community appealing now constrains our enterprise, Ezekiel noted in his ledger. Zechariah suggests we must widen our reach. Morai has designed an improved preservation method that should allow bodies to remain suitable for study even after 2 weeks of transport. The cemetery itself became a source of pride for the community. The Ashworths kept it in perfect condition, with neat rows of graves marked by increasingly elaborate headstones that Morai carved himself. Twice a year, Zechariah would organize community work days to clean the grounds, plant flowers, and fix any damage from the weather. These events usually ended with a picnic right there in the cemetery, a practice that might seem strange to outsiders, but reflected the practical way this frontier community viewed death. No one ever questioned why the Ashworths would sometimes be gone for several days at a time. They explained they were visiting suppliers in larger towns or dealing with family matters in Virginia. In reality, these trips were for delivering bodies to their medical contacts or meeting with new potential buyers. As the operation continued, the brothers created a system for communicating with their clients using coded letters exchanged through a network of postal services. The codes referred to bodies as study materials and used farming terms to describe their condition and features. Fresh bodies were called green harvests, while preserved specimens were cured crops. Specific anatomical details of interest were described using terms from the lumber industry. Specimens with knots meant bodies with tumors or unusual growths, while straight grain meant individuals with standard anatomy that was good for teaching. By 1790, the business had become so profitable that the brothers were among the richest people in the growing settlement. Though they lived simple lives to avoid drawing attention to their new wealth, they invested much of their profits in land throughout eastern Kentucky, making themselves significant property owners. This financial success allowed them to improve their facilities, including building a larger cellar with better ventilation and drainage, and a hidden back exit from their property that allowed them to move bodies to waiting wagons without being seen. The community continued to see the Ashworths with respect and thankfulness, completely unaware of the grim business happening right under their feet as they mourned at funerals or attended Sunday services. The brothers had created a perfect disguise, making themselves absolutely essential to a community that had no reason to doubt what happened after they gave their dead to the Ashworths' care. As the sun rose on October 17, 1791, a major change took place in the Ashworth operation, one that would turn them from opportunistic body snatchers into calculated murderers. The cause was a letter from Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, delivered by a merchant passing through the area. "Our need for fresh specimens has become desperate," the doctor wrote in their coded language. "The current legislation has further restricted access to traditional sources. We are prepared to offer $40 per suitable subject, with bonuses for specimens of particular educational value. The advancement of American medicine depends on institutions like yours that understand the necessities that transcend common sensibilities. Ezekiel recorded his thoughts on this development in his ledger that evening. $40 per subject changes our calculations entirely. At such rates, we need not wait for death to visit Ashworth Creek. Naturally, there are travelers on the Western Road who would not be missed, solitary men seeking opportunity in the territories. Providence delivers them to our doorstep. It would be foolish to ignore such opportunity. The brothers' first intentional victim was a traveler with no known name who had asked for shelter at the cemetery's chapel during an autumn storm. Zachariah offered the man hospitality, inviting him to have dinner at the brothers' home. The meal included wine that had been mixed with a powerful combination of herbs that Ezekiel had learned about during his time working at the hospital, a mixture that caused rapid unconsciousness followed by respiratory failure that looked like a natural death. Subject number 73. Ezekiel wrote in a clinical tone. Male, approximately 30 years, robust physique with interesting surgical scar across abdomen. No identification found. Administered the solution at dinner. Effect was swift and appeared painless. Preservation begun within the hour. Should fetch premium price from Dr. Hammond, who specifically requested surgical specimens. This was the start of a systematic campaign of murder. The brothers developed a set of criteria for choosing victims who would be least likely to be missed or searched for. They focused on solitary travelers, especially those who seemed to be heading west with no clear destination. Men looking for new opportunities on the frontier were unlikely to have told family or authorities their specific plans. The Ashworths created a system to find potential victims. Zachariah would talk with travelers, asking specific questions about their backgrounds and where they were going, figuring out if they had connections who might come looking for them. Ezekiel kept watch at the crossroads, noting which travelers were alone and seemed to carry valuable items that could be taken to make it look like robbery if a body was ever found. Morai modified the cellar to have 3 separate rooms, allowing them to process multiple victims at the same time during busy travel seasons. The brothers also improved their killing methods. The herbal mixture was changed to include ingredients that would break down quickly in the body, leaving little evidence even if an examination was done. They developed ways to get rid of victims' belongings, usually burning papers, and selling or trading valuables in distant towns during their delivery trips. By 1795, the ledgers show the operation had grown dramatically. That year alone, they shipped 28 bodies to medical schools, 19 of which were obtained through murder rather than from natural deaths in the community. The financial rewards were huge, over $1,100 that year alone, which is equal to more than $23,000 in today's money. The operation might have gone on forever if not for the brothers' increasing ambition and the changing situation of American medical education. As more medical schools opened along the eastern seaboard, the demand for cadavers grew massively. The brothers expanded their network of buyers to include schools in Baltimore, Richmond, and as far north as Boston. With this expansion came greater risks. More frequent shipments increased the chance of being discovered during transport. The brothers dealt with this by creating more complex preservation techniques and building wagons with false bottoms for moving bodies. They also started building relationships with stagecoach drivers and merchants who regularly traveled east, paying them to transport what they called special medical supplies, without asking about the contents. Perhaps most significantly, the brothers began to make connections with physicians and medical professors who were fully aware of the illegal nature of their business. These professionals, desperate for anatomical specimens to advance their research and teaching, were willing to pay high prices and provide protection through their connections with local authorities. Dr. M. from Baltimore College has proven particularly valuable. Ezekiel wrote in 1797. His cousin serves as magistrate in Harford County and ensures our wagons pass without inspection. In exchange, we provide him with 2 specimens monthly with emphasis on female subjects, which he claims are underrepresented in their teaching collection. The demand for specific types of specimens led the brothers to become more targeted in their murders. Medical schools would ask for bodies with particular features. Young men with muscular development, elderly subjects showing signs of disease, women of childbearing age, or children with birth abnormalities. The Ashworths obliged, choosing victims to match these requests whenever they could. This growing network of involved professionals is documented in the final ledger, which contains a list of 43 doctors, professors, and officials who knowingly took part in the enterprise. These included not only medical faculty but also sheriffs, judges, and even 2 state lawmakers who provided protection and helped with transportation across state lines in exchange for payments or guaranteed access to specimens for their affiliated institutions. The summer of 1800 marked another change in the brothers' operation. Zachariah, whose role had mainly been to maintain their respected place in the community, began traveling to nearby settlements to preach as a visiting minister. These trips served 2 purposes: identifying potential victims in other communities and establishing the brothers' presence over a wider area, making their frequent travels seem less suspicious. During these journeys, Zachariah would find people who fit their criteria, often the elderly or sick who lived alone, or new arrivals in communities who had not yet made strong local connections. He would then return with Ezekiel, introducing him as a doctor with special treatments not available locally. For those who accepted their help, the treatment always included medicines mixed with their lethal concoction. Acquired 3 subjects from Logan Creek this month, Ezekiel noted in August 1801. Zachariah's position as a man of God continues to open doors that would otherwise remain closed. People trust a preacher who brings a doctor to their sickbed. Their faith is touching if misplaced. As time passed, the brothers became bolder with their murders, sometimes targeting people who were more connected to their communities when specific types of specimens could be sold for extraordinarily high prices. In these cases, they were careful to make the deaths look natural or accidental. Illnesses that got worse despite treatment, falls from horses, or drownings in creeks. The scale of their operation grew to disturbing levels. Between 1800 and 1810, the ledgers document the shipment of 217 bodies, an average of nearly 2 every month. The majority were murder victims, not people who had died naturally in Ashworth Creek. The brothers had essentially created an assembly line of death, with Zachariah finding victims, Ezekiel giving the fatal preparations, and Morai handling preservation and transport. What makes this period especially chilling is how the community's trust in the Ashworths only grew deeper. Zachariah's congregation expanded, with people traveling from miles around to hear his increasingly powerful sermons about mortality and divine judgment. Ezekiel was asked to advise neighboring settlements on setting up their own cemeteries. Morai's coffins were in such demand that he trained 2 apprentices to keep up, though these young men never learned about the brothers' real business. 20 years in this community, Zachariah wrote in a rare personal entry in Ezekiel's ledger in 1804, and they look to us for guidance on how to die well. If they only knew we had become the most practiced shepherds of souls to the afterlife in all of Kentucky. Even as their enterprise thrived, there were occasional moments of danger. In the spring of 1805, a traveling merchant noticed a strange smell coming from one of the crates he had been paid to take to Richmond. When he mentioned this to Morai, he was invited to dinner at the brothers' home. The merchant was never seen again and appears in the ledger as subject number 283. In 1807, a new doctor tried to start a practice in Ashworth Creek. Dr. Thomas Bennett, who had been trained in Philadelphia, quickly became suspicious about the unusually high death rate among travelers in the area. When he began asking questions about recent deaths, the brothers recognized him as a threat. Within 3 months of his arrival, Dr. Bennett died suddenly of what Zachariah solemnly announced was brain fever. His body was buried quickly, one of the few times an Ashworth victim was actually buried in Death Valley Cemetery instead of being shipped east. Despite these close calls, the brothers' confidence in their operation grew, perhaps too much. By 1810, they had expanded their network to include middlemen in Lexington and Louisville who helped them connect with medical schools throughout the eastern United States. These go-betweens increased the brothers' reach, but also created new weak points, more people who knew at least parts of their secret. The ledgers from this period show increasing sophistication in their business operations. They started categorizing bodies based on quality and characteristics, with different pricing levels that reflected a specimen's educational value. Bodies of people who had died from interesting diseases or with unusual anatomical features could be sold for premium prices, sometimes over $100, an enormous amount of money at the time. The brothers also began taking special orders for specific specimens, essentially filling requests from medical professors looking for particular examples for their teaching. Entries from 1812 include notes like, "Subject secured to fulfill Dr. G's request for advanced tuberculosis example," and "Female subject aged approximately 20 with childbearing characteristics as requested by Medical College of Virginia." When the War of 1812 disrupted normal trade patterns, the brothers adapted their operation, sometimes storing bodies for longer periods using improved preservation techniques Ezekiel had developed. They also found that the wartime need for medical personnel created new opportunities, as quickly trained army surgeons looked for extra anatomical study whenever they could. By 1815, as America entered its post-war expansion, the Ashworths had gathered considerable wealth. While they kept up a modest appearance in Ashworth Creek, they had bought extensive properties throughout Kentucky using proxies, and had invested in various business ventures in Lexington and Louisville. The ledger suggests their total earnings from the body trade were over $25,000, a fortune in early 19th century America. The years between 1815 and 1820 were the peak of the Ashworths' operation, with their network firmly in place and their methods refined through decades of practice. They shipped an average of 36 bodies each year to medical schools across the eastern United States. Their preservation techniques had become so advanced that bodies could stay suitable for dissection even after weeks of transport, allowing them to serve clients as far away as Boston and Charleston. What the brothers failed to see, however, was that the changing landscape of America was starting to work against them. Better transportation networks meant more people traveling through areas that were once isolated. New settlements were establishing their own services, reducing their dependence on central locations like Ashworth Creek. Most importantly, communication between communities was becoming more reliable, making the disappearance of travelers more likely to be noticed and investigated. If you've been captivated by the dark tale of the Ashworth brothers so far, you are not alone. This is the kind of historical horror that continues to send chills down the spines of those brave enough to look into America's shadowy past. Take a moment to hit that like button if you're finding this story as disturbing as our research team did when uncovering these forgotten records. And if you haven't already subscribed, do it now. Our channel brings you America's most terrifying true historical cases that mainstream historians often overlook. Now, let's return to eastern Kentucky in 1820, where the Ashworths' murderous enterprise was about to face an unexpected challenge. The first major threat to the brothers' operation came in the autumn of 1820, when James Caldwell, a successful farmer from central Kentucky, passed through Ashworth Creek on his way to visit relatives in Virginia. Caldwell stopped to attend the Sunday service at the cemetery chapel, where he was warmly welcomed by Zachariah. After the service, he told Zachariah about his journey, explaining that he would be coming back in about 2 weeks. Ezekiel's ledger entry for September 24, 1820, reads, "Potential subject presented himself today. J. Caldwell, traveling alone to Virginia. Plans return journey in 2 weeks. Well dressed, approximately 45 years. Excellent physical condition. Zachariah suggests we wait for his return journey, when his absence would be attributed to the dangers of the Virginia road rather than our community." When Caldwell came back through Ashworth Creek on October 9th, he again attended the service at the chapel. Afterward, Zachariah invited him to have dinner at the brothers' home before continuing his journey. Caldwell accepted, becoming the brothers' 623rd victim. What the Ashworths could not have known was that Caldwell had recently married Elizabeth Harmon, a widow 20 years younger than him, who expected him to return to their farm near Lexington by October 15th. When Caldwell did not return, Elizabeth began making inquiries about his journey. Unlike many families of victims who accepted vague reports of travelers having accidents or getting sick on the frontier, Elizabeth Caldwell was persistent and methodical. She traced her husband's planned route, sending letters to postmasters in every town he would have passed through. In early November, she received confirmation that James had been seen in Ashworth Creek on October 9th, attending the service at the cemetery chapel. Elizabeth arrived in Ashworth Creek on November 20th, 1820, introducing herself to Zachariah and asking about her husband. The preacher expressed sympathy and confirmed that James had indeed attended the service and shared a meal with the brothers before leaving eastward around dusk. "I remember your husband well," Zachariah told her. "A good Christian man who spoke fondly of his new wife. We were concerned about him traveling so late, but he was determined to make significant progress before nightfall." Elizabeth might have accepted this explanation if she had not noticed Morai's reaction when she entered the chapel. The middle brother, who was usually quiet, had visibly paled when he heard her introduce herself as James Caldwell's wife. This small reaction planted a seed of suspicion that would eventually lead to the brothers' downfall. Instead of continuing her journey, Elizabeth took a room at the small inn in Ashworth Creek, explaining that she wanted to speak with anyone who might have seen her husband. Over the next several days, she became a familiar figure in the settlement, asking careful questions and writing down the answers in a small journal she carried. Ezekiel's ledger shows growing concern. Mrs. Caldwell remains in the settlement, asking questions about her husband's passage through the area. Zachariah has spoken with her several times, providing consistent details about J. Caldwell's departure. Morai's unease in her presence is problematic, have instructed him to avoid the woman entirely. What troubled Elizabeth most was a detail she discovered during her investigation. A young boy who had been playing near the cemetery road on the evening of October 9th mentioned seeing Mr. Caldwell's distinctive chestnut horse tied up behind the Ashworth's home well after dark, which contradicted Zachariah's story about him leaving before nightfall. When she confronted Zachariah with this inconsistency, he smoothly explained that James had indeed started his journey, but came back briefly when he realized he had forgotten his gloves at the brothers' home. This explanation might have satisfied many people, But Elizabeth noted that her husband was very careful with his belongings and had specially made gloves that he kept securely in his saddlebags while traveling. On November 28th, Elizabeth went to the local magistrate, expressing her suspicions and asking him to investigate the Ashworths. The magistrate, Jacob Turner, was initially dismissive, not wanting to question the respected brothers based on what seemed like circumstantial concerns from a worried wife. However, Elizabeth's persistence and the detailed nature of her inquiries eventually persuaded him to at least make a basic investigation. Turner visited the Ashworth home the next day, supposedly to discuss plans for expanding the cemetery. During this conversation, he casually mentioned Elizabeth Caldwell's presence in town and her concerns about her husband. The brothers kept their composure, though Ezekiel's ledger entry that evening reveals their private reaction. Magistrate Turner's visit signals potential danger. Mrs. Caldwell has involved local authority, though Turner himself seems unconvinced of any wrongdoing. Must accelerate current shipment preparation and temporarily suspend acquisition of new subjects. Zachariah suggests a controlled fire in the storage cellar might be necessary if the situation deteriorates. The situation might still have worked out in the brothers' favor if Elizabeth had not taken the extraordinary step of insisting that her husband would have wanted to be buried in the family plot if he had died during his journey. She asked Turner to issue a letter she could carry, asking any community where her husband might have died to dig up his body for transport back to Lexington. This request gave her a reason to ask about recent burials in communities along her husband's route. It also gave her an idea for her next step in the investigation. On December 3rd, Elizabeth asked Zachariah a direct question. If her husband had died on his return journey, how would the Ashworths have conducted his funeral, as the settlement's only religious and burial specialists? Zachariah, ever smooth, described the brothers' usual procedures for travelers who died in the area. We would prepare the body with dignity, hold a simple service in the chapel, and provide a marked grave in the traveler section of our cemetery. Your husband would have received God's full measure of respect in our care, Mrs. Caldwell. Elizabeth thanked him and left, but returned the next morning with Magistrate Turner and a request that struck at the very heart of the brothers' deception. I've had a troubling dream of my husband calling to me from this place, she told Turner in Zachariah's presence. For my peace of mind, I wish to have recent traveler graves opened to assure myself he is not here, misidentified perhaps, or buried without my knowledge. The brothers now faced a serious problem. Their usual practice involved fake burials with weighted coffins for community members whose bodies were shipped east. However, for travelers they murdered, they rarely performed actual burials. Instead, they processed the bodies immediately for preservation and transport. There were no graves that could be opened to satisfy Elizabeth's request without revealing their scheme. Ezekiel tried to persuade Turner not to do it, talking about religious disrespect and potential health risks from disturbing the dead. Zachariah suggested that such an action might bring God's displeasure. Morai, breaking his usual silence, argued that the ground was too frozen for such work. Turner might have been convinced by these objections, but Elizabeth had carefully built relationships with several community members during her stay. When word of her request spread, support came from an unexpected place. Martha Tunney, whose husband had been among the first people buried by the Ashworths in 1785, spoke up at a community gathering. If it would ease the poor woman's heart to know her husband isn't buried unrecognized in our ground, Christian charity demands we help her, Martha declared. I would want the same comfort were I searching for my Henry in strange territory. Faced with community feeling and Elizabeth's unwavering persistence, Turner reluctantly ordered the examination of 3 recent graves in the traveler section of the cemetery. The brothers had no choice but to agree, though Ezekiel's ledger reveals their behind-the-scenes scramble. Disaster looms. Turner has ordered grave examinations for tomorrow morning. We have no actual travelers buried in the marked plots. Morai suggests we disinter a community member buried last year and place in one of the traveler graves tonight. But identification would be impossible after our preservation process. Our only course is to allow the examination and claim confusion about grave markers. Must prepare for potential flight if suspicions intensify. On the morning of December 7, 1821, Turner, Elizabeth, and several community members gathered at Death Valley Cemetery. Morai and two assistants began digging up the first grave, marked with the name Jonathan Y. D. September 1820. After an hour of digging, they reached the coffin, which Morai opened with visible reluctance. The crowd gasped when the coffin was shown to contain not a body, but a carefully arranged collection of rocks and soil wrapped in burial cloth to look like a human form. Elizabeth immediately demanded the other graves be opened, and by midday, all three had revealed the same deception: weighted coffins with no human remains. What is the meaning of this? Turner demanded, his former respect for the Ashworths visibly shaken. Where are the bodies of these travelers? Zachariah, trying to save the situation, claimed ignorance, suggesting that grave robbers must have stolen the bodies for unknown reasons. This explanation might have seemed believable in larger cities where body snatching for medical schools was a known problem. But in isolated Ashworth Creek, with no nearby medical facilities, the excuse did not make sense. If grave robbers took these bodies, Elizabeth asked pointedly, why would they refill the coffins with rocks and rebury them? And how could they do so without anyone in the settlement noticing such extensive digging? The crowd's murmuring suggested growing suspicion. Turner ordered the brothers confined to their home while he decided what to do next. He posted 2 armed men at their door, more to protect them from potentially angry community members than to prevent escape. That night, while under this loose guard, the brothers made their decision. Ezekiel's final ledger entry reads, "All is lost. The woman's persistence has undone decades of work. We have prepared for this contingency and will implement our escape plan tonight. Essential records and accumulated funds are secured in the designated location. God's work, as we have defined it, must continue elsewhere." What followed was perhaps the most damning evidence of the brothers' guilt. Rather than face questioning, they set fire to their home, creating a distraction that allowed them to escape into the winter night. By the time the community organized to fight the fire, the Ashworths had disappeared, taking with them a wagon and supplies prepared for just such an emergency. The fire, meant to destroy evidence, instead revealed the full horror of their enterprise. As flames spread to the undertaking establishment, community members working to contain the blaze discovered the hidden trap door leading to the brothers' secret cellar. What they found below would haunt the settlement for generations. 3 chambers had been carved from the Kentucky clay. The first contained specialized tools for dissection and preservation, along with chemicals the local people did not recognize. The second chamber held 5 bodies in various stages of preservation, including that of James Caldwell, identifiable by the distinctive gold ring still on his finger, the wedding band Elizabeth had described in her inquiries. The third chamber, however, contained the most disturbing discovery: 16 leather-bound ledgers documenting nearly 40 years of the brothers' gruesome trade. These meticulous records, which Ezekiel had apparently thought were too valuable to destroy or take in their hurried escape, provided undeniable evidence of their crimes and the extensive network that had made them possible. "I knew my husband was here," Elizabeth Caldwell said quietly, as she identified James' body. A wife knows when she's being lied to about the man she loves. Turner, overwhelmed by the size of the discovery, sent riders to the nearest larger settlements, asking for help from county and state authorities. Within days, officials from Lexington arrived to begin a formal investigation, bringing with them a doctor who confirmed that the preservation methods used on the bodies matched those commonly used by medical schools. As news of the discovery spread, communities throughout eastern Kentucky began questioning deaths and burials the Ashworths had handled. The investigation expanded as officials tried to match ledger entries with missing persons reports and unmarked graves. The final death toll attributed to the brothers, 637 victims over 37 years, made them perhaps the most prolific murderers in American history up to that point. The scope of the conspiracy revealed in the ledgers sent shock waves through the medical establishment. The final volume contained the names of 43 physicians, medical professors, and officials who had knowingly participated in the enterprise. Some had simply bought cadavers without asking questions about their source, but others had actively helped the brothers' operation, providing protection from authorities and placing specific orders for bodies with particular characteristics. It appears the Ashworths were merely the most visible portion of a vast criminal enterprise stretching across 6 states, wrote Judge William Harrison, who oversaw the subsequent investigation. The demand from our medical institutions for anatomical specimens created an incentive for murder on an industrial scale, with respected professionals choosing to ignore the obvious ethical questions their purchases should have raised. If you've been following the Ashworth family's horrific tale so far, you've barely scratched the surface of one of early America's most disturbing criminal enterprises. Our research team has uncovered details that historians have overlooked for centuries. Show your support by hitting that like button and leaving a comment about what aspects of this dark history you find most chilling. For those brave souls who want more historical horror stories that mainstream historians won't touch, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Let's continue with the aftermath of the Ashworth brothers' shocking crimes. The investigation into the Ashworth brothers' crimes continued for nearly 2 years, becoming one of the most extensive criminal inquiries of early 19th century America. Officials faced extraordinary challenges in documenting the full extent of the brothers' activities, particularly in identifying victims and telling their families. Many of the Ashworths' victims were travelers without strong connections to communities, making identification nearly impossible decades after their disappearances. Officials made the difficult decision to rebury the unidentified remains in a mass grave at the edge of what had been Death Valley Cemetery, marked with a simple stone that read, "Here lie the victims of man's inhumanity to man, 1784 to 1821. For the families who could identify their loved ones, the discoveries were devastating. Martha Tunney, who had spoken so movingly of her husband Henry's funeral conducted by the Ashworths in 1785, learned that his body had never been buried in Death Valley Cemetery. According to the ledgers, he had been the brothers' 7th shipment, sent to a medical college in Philadelphia 2 days after his funeral service. For 36 years, I've brought flowers to an empty grave, Martha told the Lexington Gazette in 1822. I've spoken to Henry there, believing his remains were listening from beneath the soil. To learn that strangers have cut apart his body hundreds of miles away, there are no words for such a violation. The investigation into the medical professionals named in the ledgers proved equally challenging. Many of the earliest collaborators had died by the time of the discovery. Others used their considerable influence to avoid prosecution. Several fled to Europe when news of the investigation became public. In the end, Only 11 of the 43 named individuals faced formal charges, and just 4 were convicted, all receiving relatively light sentences compared to the size of their involvement. Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College, whose 1791 letter had encouraged the brothers to start murdering travelers, was among those who escaped justice. By the time investigators tracked him to Baltimore in 1823, he had boarded a ship for England, never to return to American shores. The Ashworth brothers themselves vanished into the expanding American frontier, despite one of the most extensive manhunts of the era, with descriptions circulated throughout the United States and into Canada. No confirmed sightings were ever documented. Rumors occasionally surfaced. 3 brothers matching their description operating a small church in Missouri in 1824. An undertaker named Ashfield in western Pennsylvania, whose preservation techniques matched Ezekiel's methods. A traveling preacher in Tennessee, who looked like Zachariah, but called himself Thomas Blackwood. It is a disturbing possibility that the Ashworths, having perfected their deception over decades, may have simply established themselves elsewhere under new identities. Judge Harrison wrote in his final report on the case in 1825, "Men capable of maintaining such a facade of respectability while committing unspeakable crimes would find little difficulty in creating new personas on the frontier where questions about one's past are considered impolite at best." The case had deep impacts on American medicine and burial practices. Medical schools faced increased scrutiny and regulation regarding how they acquired anatomical specimens. Several states passed laws specifically making it illegal to sell and buy bodies for dissection outside of very narrow legal channels, though the ongoing shortage of cadavers meant that a black market continued to exist well into the 20th century. Communities throughout the Appalachian region developed new customs to make sure their dead were actually buried as intended. These included multi-day wakes where the body was never left alone, burial societies whose members personally oversaw every part of the burial, and in some areas, the practice of sitting up with the dead, where community members would keep watch at the grave for several days after burial to prevent disturbance. The settlement of Ashworth Creek, stained by its connection to the brothers' crimes, officially changed its name to Providence in 1823. Death Valley Cemetery was deconsecrated, with most families choosing to dig up their loved ones' coffins, finding in almost every case that they contained only rocks and soil instead of human remains. The cemetery grounds were eventually abandoned and taken back by the forest, with only the mass grave marker remaining visible by the middle of the 19th century. The psychological impact on the community was perhaps the most profound and lasting effect. People who had trusted the Ashworths completely, had cried with Zachariah at funerals, had shaken Ezekiel's hand in gratitude for his careful preparation of loved ones, had admired Marai's craftsmanship, now questioned their own ability to judge character. "We invited wolves into our fold and called them shepherds," wrote Rebecca Lansing, a longtime resident of the settlement, in a letter to her sister in Virginia. "We gave them our dead to tend and never questioned when they grew prosperous from such somber work. What does it say about our discernment that men capable of such calculating evil were our most respected citizens for nearly 40 years? The case gradually faded from public awareness as the 19th century progressed. Occasional newspaper articles would revisit the Kentucky body merchants on anniversaries of the discovery, but the full details were considered too gruesome for Victorian sensibilities. By the early 20th century, the Ashworth case had become little more than a footnote in criminal history, sometimes mentioned in medical ethics discussions, but largely forgotten by the general public. This might have remained the case if construction workers had not dug up a metal box while excavating for a new road near Somerset, Kentucky, in 1918. Inside were 17 leather-bound ledgers, the original 16 from the brothers' cellar, which had been held as evidence during the investigation, plus a 17th volume that had never been found during the initial discovery. This final ledger, apparently hidden separately from the others, contained the brothers' backup plans, including detailed maps to hidden stashes of money buried throughout eastern Kentucky, and a coded list of contacts who had agreed to help them create new identities if their operation was discovered. Most disturbingly, it included Ezekiel's thoughts on their decades of murder, showing a man who saw his crimes not with regret, but with clinical pride in how efficient their operation had been. "We have advanced medical knowledge more than any physicians of our era," he wrote in an entry dated July 1821, just months before their discovery. "The bodies we have provided have trained hundreds of doctors who would otherwise have practiced with inadequate anatomical understanding. If each of these physicians saves even a handful of patients due to their superior training, our work has saved more lives than the number we have taken. History, should it ever judge us, must consider this calculus." The discovery of these additional records sparked new interest in the case. The ledgers were transferred to the Kentucky Historical Society, where researchers began the careful process of analyzing their contents using modern investigative techniques not available to 19th century officials. This research revealed aspects of the case that had gone unnoticed during the original investigation. The brothers' network had been even larger than first believed. The ledgers documented connections with anatomists in Europe, with several shipments sent to medical schools in Edinburgh and Paris via trusted sea captains who asked no questions about the research materials they were transporting. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Modern economic analysis of the recorded payments suggests the brothers had earned the equivalent of over $4 million in today's money through their body trafficking enterprise. Most of this wealth was never found, presumably hidden in the caches mentioned in the 17th ledger, locations described in code that researchers have still not completely figured out. Perhaps most significantly, the additional records suggested that the brothers' operation had inspired copycats. Ezekiel had documented correspondence with at least 7 other individuals or groups who had set up similar operations in other isolated communities across the Appalachian region, asking for his advice on preservation techniques and transportation arrangements. "Our methods have created a new industry that will persist even if we do not," Ezekiel wrote in 1818. "The demand from medical science is insatiable, and we have demonstrated how effectively this demand can be met by those with sufficient resolve and ingenuity. I have shared our techniques selectively with individuals who show proper appreciation for the necessary discretion." This revelation raised a disturbing possibility that the Ashworths' approach to supplying cadavers through strategic murder might have influenced how bodies were obtained throughout the eastern United States during the 19th century. Medical historians now suggest that the unusual consistency in preservation methods seen in anatomical specimens from this period may indicate a standardized approach passed down from the Ashworths to their followers. The final pages of the 17th ledger contain what appears to be the brothers' contingency plan, detailed instructions for creating new identities in Missouri Territory, including contacts who would vouch for them, properties bought under false names, and strategies for introducing themselves to new communities. "We will begin again, wiser for this experience," Ezekiel wrote in what appears to be his final entry before their escape. Zechariah suggests we operate independently henceforth, maintaining connection only through our established courier network, one man raising no suspicion where 3 might. The work continues, though our methods must evolve. Historical researchers have tried to trace the brothers' movements using these plans, but the trail goes cold at the Mississippi River. Records suggest individuals matching their descriptions may have traveled on riverboats bound for St. Louis in early 1822. But confirmation of their ultimate fate remains elusive nearly 2 centuries later. Elizabeth Caldwell, whose persistence had exposed the brothers' crimes, stayed in Kentucky after the investigation. Using a part of her husband's estate, she established a small school in Lexington that eventually became one of the state's respected academies. She never married again, dedicating herself instead to educational reform and later in life to advocating for better oversight of medical education and anatomical study. In 1860, nearly 40 years after the Ashworth case, Elizabeth gave a rare interview to the Louisville Courier, thinking back on the events that had shaped her life's path. "People often ask if I am proud of uncovering such evil," she said. "I feel no pride, only a deep sadness that my James and hundreds of others were sacrificed on the altar of medical progress. If there is any consolation, it is that their deaths eventually led to reforms that prevented countless similar atrocities." The Ashworths exposed a terrible truth about how our society valued certain lives less than others, particularly those without wealth or connections. I hope we have learned something from that revelation, though I fear human nature changes slowly, if at all. The story of the Ashworth brothers serves as a chilling reminder of how trusted institutions and respected individuals can hide unimaginable evil. The brothers maintained their disguise of respectability for nearly 40 years, using the community's trust and the isolation of the frontier to carry out one of history's most extensive murder enterprises. Their story also highlights the ethical compromises that came with early medical advancement in America, how the desperate need for anatomical knowledge created conditions where those willing to supply cadavers without asking questions could make enormous profits, no matter their methods. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that the brothers completely escaped justice, potentially creating new identities and continuing their practices elsewhere. The 17th ledger's mention of followers trained in their methods suggests their influence may have reached far beyond their own direct actions, creating a legacy of exploitation that continued throughout the 19th century. As you listen to this account of the Ashworth brothers and their crimes, consider this. How many other historical horrors remain buried in forgotten records and abandoned cemeteries? How many other trusted community figures throughout history have hidden similar dark businesses behind masks of respectability? The story of Death Valley Cemetery reminds us that history's darkest chapters often lie just beneath the surface of the official story, waiting for someone persistent enough to uncover them. Now that you've heard this disturbing piece of forgotten American history, we hope you'll join our community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to look into the darkest corners of our past. Subscribe to our channel for more carefully researched historical horror stories that mainstream historians often overlook. Hit the notification bell to make sure you never miss our weekly uploads, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Ashworth brothers' crimes. What other historical mysteries would you like us to investigate next? Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, especially when it's been buried for centuries.